In the passage this week, we find two encounters where life is in the balance, where decisions and conversations are leading rapidly towards life-ending choices. Now, these passages are not an easy read, and the people we are looking at are in some of the worst moments of their lives. In these texts, some of the most tense, terrifying, and tumultuous episodes of the Gospels are on full display. We find a dark world of religious and political life into which Jesus is pulled, and it becomes more openly vicious and destructive in these passages. There are interrogations, there are threats, there are judgments, decisions, and ultimately executions. In only a few verses we can catch a glimpse of humanity nearing its worst. So, if you are ready, let's begin. We're looking at Matthew 26 to begin with, starting at verse 57. Those who arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the teachers of the law and the elders had assembled. But Peter followed him at a distance. Right up to the courtyard of the high priest, he entered and sat down with the guards to see the outcome. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus, so that they could put him to death. But they did not find any, though many false witnesses came forward. Finally, two came forward and declared, "This fellow said, 'I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days.'" Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent. The high priest said to him, "I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." "You have said so," Jesus replied. "But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" "He is worthy of death," they answered. Then they spit in his face and struck him with their fists. Others slapped him and said, "Prophesy to us, Messiah. Who hit you?" Now we're jumping forward to chapter 27, beginning at verse 1. Early in the morning, all the chief priests and the elders of the people made their plans how to have Jesus executed. So they bound him, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate, the governor. When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. "I have sinned," he said, "for I have betrayed innocent blood." "What is that to us?" they replied. "That's your responsibility." So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. The chief priests picked up the coins and said, "It is against the law to put this into the treasury, since it is blood money." So they decided to use the money to buy the potter's field as a burial place for foreigners. That is why it has been called the Field of Blood to this day. Then, what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. They took the 30 pieces of silver, the price set on him by the people of Israel, and they used them to buy the potter's field, as the Lord commanded me. Now, before I share my thoughts on these passages, I want you to share with one another. What are your first reflections? How does this passage make you feel? And what sticks out to you? In these passages, we are seeing a variety of people who have strayed far from seeing the image of God in one another, and ultimately for Judas, in himself. As followers of a living God who offers people eternal life, we are custodians of the promise that each life has eternal value. You are fearfully and wonderfully made, it says in Psalm 139. As Christians, we believe that each person was created by God. We are all incredibly precious, therefore. Our lives have value because our Maker designed us with care. He knows you because he formed you. Human rights and human dignity are that part of the moral call to look after one another, to say that there are ethical boundaries and limits to how we should treat one another and how we should treat human life. But as we know, in many societies, times and cultures, the worth of life is reduced to almost nothing. I recently experienced this. I visited a slave-holding castle in Cape Coast in Ghana. In this castle, 4 million slaves were transferred through, or abused, or killed on their way to the plantations of Virginia and the West Indies. In that castle, I caught a glimpse of how human life was stripped of its dignity and treated as though it were not made by God or created in God's image. Christians were part of doing that horrendous work. Even our own church in England had a role to play in investing in it. And as I stood in the dark in the slave dungeons, with the body remains of those who inhabited those cells still literally beneath my feet, I was horrified by how far we can lose our way, by how far we can degrade those who Isaiah in chapter 58 says are our own flesh and blood, and who we turn away from. When I return to think about the passages we just read, I see that in them we find an array of people appearing in this court where God stands on trial. There are witnesses, there are judges, there are accusers, there are perpetrators, there are traitors, and there are profiteers. There are lots of different kinds of people drawn into great evil. We don't know their names, but we catch their words and some glimpse of their actions. And for me, what we find is a picture of a culture being presented here in almost snapshot form, passing glances of a justice system which has just descended into corruption veiled by lip service ethics. This is not the only time in history and across our world that we see people being treated like this, and it still happens today. So as you ponder on it, my question to you to begin your conversation is, who are the people you see involved in these passages? Who can you spot? Why do you think they have ended up participating in this? Now, there are 2 further features of the passage that will be worth some discussion. The first is, why do you think Jesus stays quiet? It says he stayed silent to begin with, and then, after interrogation, speaks. What do you believe he's talking about? As some context before you discuss this, the bit on the Son of Man that Jesus is talking about in that first part of the passage is referring to the book of Daniel in the Old Testament. In the book of Daniel, there is a picture Daniel prophesies of how time will unfold across history and result eventually in a new kingdom. In that passage, and I wonder if Jesus is referencing this, there is a prophetic challenge by Daniel to the king under which his people are being ruled. The challenge is that all power eventually comes to an end, including the king's. Hearing this in the book of Daniel, the king ultimately goes mad at the thought. And if you want to see an artistic rendition of this, because there are many, look at William Blake's King Nebuchadnezzar. It's really weird. But why I want to reference this and why I think Jesus is referencing this is because I wonder if he's saying to the court in his day, your power is temporary. It is limited. He is attacking the very basic foundations that give them a sense of authority and control. He's not just saying, I am God. He is also saying, you are not God. Which is probably hard to hear when you're used to being in charge and using to rule over life and death. But why do you think he stays quiet? Why do you think Jesus stays silent? Can you see any other reasons? Finally, we come to another difficult part of the passage. A symbolic move and a real life which has been remembered and recorded across the centuries. Judas ending his own life. For many, those listening to this in our groups, we have varying experience of what this has looked like in our own lives or the lives of others. So it can be a hard text to read and think about. Judas in this passage has strayed so far, he loses sight of the preciousness of his own life and how God has made him. He is a picture of one particular individual in so much pain that he looks to end it. Now, I work with a church in my day job called Fountains in the centre of Bradford. Fountains was set up in an abandoned nightclub, which has now been transformed into spaces for worship, food banks, social outreach, ultimately mission and ministry. Now, one of the congregations part of Fountains is a church focused on wrestling, where they figure out faith and the stories of the gospel in the Bible through getting in the ring and literally wrestling. And there's an audience and there's lots of people, lots of lights. Right, if you want to find out more about it, there is actually a documentary on the BBC called We Are England, the Bradford Church of Wrestling. I'm sure there's a link to it somewhere, but it's an interesting watch. And there is a lot of really good stuff in it. So do take a look if you get a chance. But one of the people that I want to draw attention to is a man who, you'll see if you watch the documentary, who found himself wanting to end his own life. And he was at the end of a pier. And as he walked on, he decided to call a friend. And that friend was one of the team leading the wrestling church in Fountains. And that conversation on that call ultimately led to the man turning around, turning away from the end of the pier. In the documentary, we see how that one phone call resulted in that man getting involved in wrestling church, and through that exploring faith and eventually even being baptized. His is one beautiful, fragile life rescued at the very brink. And it reminds me that there is always a way back. If that you are in that place, there are people that can help you. There are the Samaritans, who are a free 24/7 service and who are not afraid of going to those difficult areas with you. Or in our church family at G2, the leadership team will be happy to talk to you, free of judgment or condemnation. You're not a burden. I think if Judas had gone to Jesus, there would have been a way back. Because Judas is in all of us. Our self-annihilation, or our desire to reject ourselves and God and others because of what we've done, or who we've become, or just the circumstances we're facing. But the face of Jesus to Judas and to you is not one of hatred. He stands with open arms. The story of Judas to me is much as a warning as a tragedy, because there is always a way back with Jesus. There is always an opportunity for redemption in him. And that doesn't mean it isn't very hard ground. But like the story of the prodigal son that Jesus tells, where the father rushes out with each step as his returning son, the voice of Jesus is one of acceptance and care, not condemnation or rejection. So go to him. And as we finish group today, I'd love you to pray for one another, that we'd know how God values you and how you could know more of that value. Perhaps discuss with one another and pray with one another. How could you see more of that value God sees in you